Kia ora koutou. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening on a lovely Wednesday evening outside. So I'm Hema Sridhar. I'm the Strategic Advisor for Technological Futures here at Koito. Prior to that, I was the Chief Science Advisor for Defence, and I've worked in the defence and national security sector for the last 20 years. So this is a topic that I'm personally very interested in, and I've been following over the last 2 decades. So it's been really insightful having the afternoon with Darren and talking about this. And hopefully at the end of this, you also leave with the same levels of enthusiasm that we've had today in our conversations earlier. I want to take an opportunity to thank the Australian High Commission who worked with us in bringing Darren out here, but also in helping in terms of all of the kinds of the possible conversations that we are going to have this afternoon. So thank you for your support in arranging this. So before Darren gets started, I'd like to introduce Sir Peter Gluckman, who would like to say a few words to kick us off.
First of all, I'd really like to thank the Australian High Commissioner, who's here, has to leave in a few minutes, Hajinga Sidhu, who's really been a great partner over the last few months in talking with Koito about the various matters that are actually dealt with in this presentation. Because technology, geopolitics, science, economics, social cohesion, New Zealand's future, Australia's future, are all actually intimately linked, and we tend to think about them in different buckets. And yet what we're trying to do in Koito in particular, where we put a lens on it, probably more from the social cohesion point of view than the other point, is bring this all together. So when Hajinda suggested that we might want to spend some time with Darren here, it was just a marvellous opportunity to actually hear from another scholar from another set of disciplines that interfaces with the very way we're trying to explore the issues using social cohesion, geopolitics, technology, economics, New Zealand's future, and coming at it in a slightly different lens, but on the same set of interface issues. So Darren is a very distinguished, not sure what to call you, lawyer, economist, political scientist, international scholar at ANU, Australian National University, who thinks a lot and actually brings a very valuable synthesis of economics, geopolitics and technology together, and tries to put into the context not just of the big macro global situation, but how countries like New Zealand and Australia have to navigate this, because whether we like it or not, we're forced to navigate this interface. It's getting more and more complicated. It's got lots of unknowns in it, and yet you can't avoid decisions having to be made, because we have to eat, we have to buy stuff, sell stuff, we have to defend what we think is valuable, and we have to have societies that work in the face of very rapidly changing technologies. Now, we can all argue about which in this complicated Venn diagram is the most important, or the thing that drives the others, and the truth is they're all important and they all interface with each other and lead to a situation where the kind of very robust analysis which Darren is undertaking at least points to what kind of questions we have to ask of ourselves, because if we don't ask the right questions, we can't possibly come to the right answers. So it's a very complicated story. I could talk to Darren for hours. We've been talking quite a lot this afternoon, and I think only coming to the tip of the iceberg of where the rubber hits the road, and in the group we had up at Koito, we were even seeing that even identifying what the real questions is not entirely easy. So I'm going to turn it over to Darren for an analysis which I think you'll find is both thought-provoking and not necessarily comforting. I'll leave it at that. Darren, over to you.
Sorry, Peter, just before Darren though, it's just I'm going to invite the Australian High Commissioner Herinda Sidhu to say a few words as well.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangataha maha tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to Sir Peter Gluckman and to Koitu and the Centre for Informed Futures, to HEMA, to all the team at the Centre for hosting this evening's event. And good evening to everybody. We are so delighted to have Dr Darren Lim in Auckland this evening to speak about, as Peter's explained and as you can see on the screen there, technology and geopolitics, the connection between them and what this means for Australia and for New Zealand. Geopolitics, of course, I'm a diplomat, that's my stock in trade, that's what we do, and that's how I see the world. Increasingly, it isn't something that is out there. I have been in this business a very long time, much longer than my youthful looks might demonstrate. And the world has changed a tremendous amount in that time. I have seen the kind of technology that we think about, computers, mobile phones, etc., rise and start to dominate our lives in that time. But from a geopolitical standpoint, one of the things that we were talking about, Emma mentioned, a couple of decades you've been thinking about this. Well, a couple of decades ago, people were talking a great deal about global megatrends. It was, I think, a millennial thing. We've suddenly come into the new millennium and we're thinking about what those megatrends look like. And those sorts of things that they were talking about then, I recall many conversations talking about the shift of the centre of global power from west to east, demographic changes as people moved around the world, environment and climate change and all the implications of that, and technology. And I think that when we were thinking about technology, we probably did, and we continue to think about it in very small and narrow terms. But at that time, even what we could imagine the world would be like in 20-odd years' time, which is where we are now, I think we could not really imagine the speed, the scope, the scale of what we've seen in terms of technology change, nor its impact in the world and the impact on our daily lives. So we're so fortunate to have Darren, who is not just an economist but a big picture thinker, who's able to grasp up these issues. It's requiring us to think in new and different ways. We are having to cross disciplines to truly understand what it is we're facing and what it is we need to bring things together. And so I'm so delighted that we have Darren here today because he's been thinking about all these issues: technology, great power competition, global economic developments and national security and all the linkages between them. For any of you who have listened to the Australia in the World podcast, which Darren is the host of, and I highly recommend it, if you haven't, you will know that Darren has a very particular knack for making the intangible tangible and the abstract real. We're in a very particular moment in history right now. The world has changed, and it's continuing to change around us. We're all facing complex headwinds across multiple interlocking fronts: economic, security, technological, climate, all of that. For Australia and New Zealand, this poses very particular challenges, and those are the questions that we need to grapple with tonight. One of the things I have often observed is that for our two countries, the sorts of intangible things that we have between us are now things of value, and that particularly relates to the level of understanding and confidence and trust we have between us. In the world we're in now, that trust is a strategic asset, and it's something that as a diplomat and in my role, I continue to work to invest in. Anyway, you've heard enough from me, so I'm going to just hand over to my good friend Dr Darren Lim, and I really look forward to hearing his insights. Thank you all very much.
Humour me. So before Darren does come out, his bio's been extensively covered, but I will read you some bits in here because there are some really good points. So obviously you already know that he is a senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at ANU in Australia. He teaches international relations at the intersection of international political economy, international security, and global governance. His major research interests focuses on economic security, including economic coercion, technology competition and industrial policy, grand strategy in the context of power transitions in international order and Australian foreign policy. He regularly advises governments and private sectors on questions of economic security, focusing on how to navigate an increasingly complex international economic landscape that is being reshaped by geopolitics, national security, and economic nationalism. He also hosts a podcast which you already heard about, and I have listened to it, so I would recommend listening to it if you're interested. He's the Australian Foreign Minister and many other senior officials are among its regular listenership. So on that note, Darren, over to you.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Wednesday night. The weather was delightful today. It rained a little bit, but it's been a very cold Canberra winter, and I know it can be cold here as well, but it was very pleasant. So thank you for making the time. Thanks to Peter, to Hema and to Harinder for the introduction. It's a big topic, technology and geopolitics, and so hopefully over the next 20 minutes or so, my goal is to justify why you'd put the two of them in a sentence together, how and why you would do so, I suppose, and really set the table for a conversation. I mean, I'm sure there's a great variance in the knowledge. Some of you are probably international relations students or scholars, others are professionals. I am just going to try and set a baseline for all of us, and then we can use that to launch off into a conversation. So let's start with some quotes. We've got to have some quotes and some pictures. You all know who this guy is. And in the US national security strategy, you had this language about China presenting America's most consequential geopolitical challenge, the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military and technological power to advance that objective. You'll notice technological power underlined. That's what we're talking about this evening. Let's move across to Xi Jinping. The Western countries led by the US have implemented all-round containment, encirclement and suppression against us, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to China's development. So you have a US perspective about the challenge China is posing, including in technology, and then a Chinese perspective that sees this as containment, right? Unjustified, of course, of their natural rise. So I feel like that allows me to introduce what International Relations 101. And for those of you who studied it, I apologise, but let's again set the table so we're all on the same page. And the baseline assumption of a lot of IR theory is that survival is the foundational interest of any social and political grouping. And of course, we think about that mostly in the context of nation states. And nation states have faced violence and war forever, right? For as long as humans have been around, unfortunately, we have been violent against each other, and war has been a feature of human history. And so the most fundamental political grouping of the modern world, the nation state, has to worry about its survival. It has to worry about its national security, even as it pursues other objectives like economics, welfare, and social objectives as well. And so the term geopolitics actually is not that old. It comes from the late 19th century. And back then, large countries who were looking out on the world were worried about their peer competitors, right? They were worried about other countries that could challenge them and sought, as a result, to maximise their power, their military power, their economic power, their ideological power. That's always been true. But in the 19th century, power basically meant territory, right? It meant, and that's why we have the geo in geopolitics. And the international relations then was the struggle between major powers for control over territory, right? Because that was seen as the primary pathway to power. And you see that map there from work by Mackinder in 1904. He defined heartlands, the hinterlands, and you can see this pivot area, which is the Eurasian landmass, which is where all the action was happening. But the logic there was all about territory as the foundational component of national power, and therefore the foundational component of national security. Now, if territory was power in the late 19th and early 20th century, the idea would evolve over the course of the 20th century. We had the world wars, where it was about alliances and the control of natural resources. Think the Japan's oil desire for oil in World War II. You had the Cold War, where power was really involved the domino theory, and you can see that little graphic there. What other countries believe? Whose side were they on? Was there this domino effect that could tip the balance of power in the world? And then in the post-war period, which was a time of US hegemony, as you all know, we talked less about competition, but power was associated with globalisation. The major security threat was failed states. And then post 9/11, of course, we were focused on defeating terrorism. So power changed in its understanding, right, from its origins in the late 19th century of geopolitics across the 20th century. This, of course, brings us to the 21st century. And so we should ask ourselves, like, what is the equivalent of the control of territory? What does it mean in the 21st century? What are the sources of power and security? Now, there are continuities, right? Alliances still matter, security relationships, military capabilities and arms build-up still matter. We still care about third countries, right? Sort of echoes of the domino theory. Power means being able to influence the decisions of third countries. And of course, there's an ideological dimension to today as well, right? There is a values contest between liberal democracy as one example and the China model as one of the alternatives that's put forward. So there are continuities in today's world, but there are other dimensions that need to be emphasised. The first is, having returned to geopolitics or geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, there's now much more of a focus on relative gains rather than absolute gains. So a focus on not just how you are benefiting, but how much your adversary or rival is benefiting, and the relative gains that are being achieved. And that leads into a zero-sum mindset. That if you are winning, if you are benefiting, by definition, I must be losing. There's also an immense amount of mistrust, right? Strategic mistrust, where the two sides are making worst-case assumptions about the intentions of the other, right? Probably not understanding them very well, but assuming that they have hostile motivations. And into this geopolitical dynamic, you've got other forces which are exacerbating these tensions. Nationalism, populism, certainly post-2016, and increasingly in recent years, protectionism, right? And so these often have domestic foundations, but they then feed into the dynamics between the US and China and international relations more generally, and actually can make things worse. Now, I want to sort of talk about the old order that was sort of used to dominate in the post-war period through to only about 10 or so years ago. And I'm going to use the word neoliberalism. It doesn't have to be called that, but I think it's a nice provocative title. And it describes the mindset that governed sort of international economics. And that mindset was one of absolute gains, right? That economic logic was the core animating purpose of the international system. A focus on absolute gains rather than relative gains, right, where everyone could be made wealthier and more prosperous and develop, and everyone could win. There was a win-win focus. And the system that emerged was one of interdependence, right, where trade and financial relations created these mutual dependencies, but that was seen as an opportunity, right, that you were able to leverage the gains from trade, the logic of Adam Smith, and economic efficiency was the name of the game, right? We're trying to maximise our growth, maximise our prosperity. And security in that world was very much an exception. Earlier this afternoon, there was a discussion of Article 21 of the GATT, which is the national security exception to free trade, as it was written in the 1940s. But it was very much like an exception to a system that otherwise looked to promote free trade, where free trade was seen as a positive because it made the world better off and everyone within it, or at least many within it. And what my colleague Anthony Roberts at the ANU has described as an emerging geoeconomic order flips all of these logics, and is sort of the foundation for the link between technology and geopolitics that I want to talk about this evening. Firstly, in a security world, right, as I've already mentioned, there's a focus on a shift from absolute gains to relative gains. And peace sort of becomes a precondition rather than a product of those relationships. Interdependence is now very much a source of vulnerability, right? It is not seen as an opportunity, right? It is seen as a risk that can pose problems for the national interest, in particular in the realm of national security. And, of course, then national security becomes rather not the exception, but the rule, right? Where national security exceptions to free trade, right, become so frequent and so wide that they sort of swallow the rule entirely. We're not quite there yet, but that is the direction we go in, where it is seen to be a legitimate departure from the old order, increasingly for national security reasons. And why is that? I mean, this is the standard story of geopolitics. There's been obviously a rebalancing of power in the system, a closing. The US is no longer the unparalleled hegemon. China is very much caught up, and that has created this sort of dynamic. Then there has been this sort of convergence, right, of competitors into the one system. In the Cold War, right, the GATT and then the WTO were able to flourish because the Western Bloc didn't really engage with the Eastern Bloc, with the Soviet Bloc. There wasn't that much trade or investment flowing across the two of them. But now, economics and security are really mixed together, right? Our major source of economic opportunity is also increasingly a security competitor, and that is a real change. And that has created a degree of integration between the two countries or the two systems that is also a departure from the Cold War, right? So we have a very successful system that has led to growth and modernity, but in an era where power has equalised, right, those connections become a source of anxiety and vulnerability. So this brings me, to technology. What are the two sides trying to achieve in the technology domain? The US obviously wants to preserve its leadership, right? It has been the dominant power in technology. Just think of Silicon Valley. And so part of them preserving that is going to be restraining access to those who would replace it, right? Especially vis-a-vis the PRC, right? They want to restrain China's access to technology, and you've seen things like export controls, and I'll talk about those in a minute. On the Chinese side, right, technology is a critical part of the Chinese project. They need to become a more sophisticated producer, right? Move up the value chain to escape the middle income trap and become a wealthy country, but also, of course, to be a true geopolitical peer of the US requires China to operate on the frontiers of technology, right? So they want to develop and acquire new technologies and the knowledge that undergirds them, right? So the two sides have these conflicting interests in the technology space. And so the two of them are then engaging in a series of strategies that are bringing them into conflict in the technology domain, not just in the sort of military domain, in the ideological domain, but actually in the technology domain. On the Chinese side, you see efforts to try to make technology, to develop through systems of state support, national champions. You see efforts to transact, to acquire technology through companies and IP, through market means. And you do see there's certainly evidence of taking, right? Either open source collection, but, according to allegations in the US, large-scale industrial theft, like industrial espionage and IP theft, right? Or to acquire these technologies that will fuel their economy and their military. On the US side, you see strategies to try to stop this, right? So shielding US technologies, right? Stopping technologies from being shared with the Chinese side. Stifling Chinese innovation, right? This is what export controls do, say, on semiconductors and lithography machines, trying to actually hold down the Chinese ecosystem. And then sparing their own, right? The equivalent to the industrial policy on the making side, in China, with things like Made in China 2025, you've got the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Bill, which are trying to spur US industry, right, and US innovation in the technology space. And so both sides have these clear national interests in technology, and they've got these strategies which are, again, bringing them into a clash with each other. Now, really, this is work by my colleague Anthony Roberts at the ANU, who I work with very closely, and she has this graphic that comes from a paper from Jonathan Tucker in 1991, and I think it's a really interesting way of framing the thinking about technology. Here you can see in green, and you can see sort of benefit is on the top and cost on the bottom, that engaging with and trading with economically your competitor brings an economic payoff, right? If the US sells technology to China, US companies make profits, they can reinvest those profits into R&D, they can pay dividends to shareholders, workers have jobs and so forth. It is a clear economic payoff. But you can see how, in a positional sense, as China has developed, become wealthier, become more powerful, has caught up to the US, the more and more economic engagement occurs, the stronger China becomes at the same time. And even though China might just be catching up with the US, of course, in a positional sense, in a relative sense, the two countries are getting closer, right? And so, the green arrow is this linear, launch into infinity, right? There's still gains to be had, but in a positional sense, the US becomes a greater loser. And so if you combine those two together, right, eventually the net payoff becomes negative, right? And I think that's what we're seeing. So we can take this general, and this was modelled on economics, right, and monopoly and oligopolistic competition, and working with your competitors versus competing with them. We can, I think, then apply this, and my colleague Anthony has done this, to US-China competition. I'm sorry you've got to turn your head to the side to see this, but in blue there you see sort of the beginning of China's reform and opening up period in 1979 through to around about 2010, right, where the clear benefits were bringing China into the system, right? It benefited the world. It's why we have cheap computers and cheap footwear and clothing and cheap televisions. It was good for everyone, right? And China was only a medium-sized country growing very rapidly, did not pose a major challenge in terms of power and resources to the US. But that begins to change, right? And China's development continues. When you're compounding growth, by the middle of the 2010s, China's economy is really surging along. It's developing national champions, and it's becoming a major player in the global economy, right? And so that, again, that positional payoff begins to shift. And then, from around the time Trump is elected through to, say, just a couple of years ago, right, now the US is going, hang on, China dominates certain supply chains. It has very powerful companies that are developing their own technologies, that are becoming major market players around the world. This is becoming a real concern for us. And then, of course, you could argue from around 2022 onwards, again, these dates are a little bit arbitrary. From a US point of view, right, the payoff has gone negative, right? The risks that are posed by that loss of position outweigh the clear economic benefits. That's not to say those economic benefits don't still exist, but they no longer justify the level of engagement that sort of defined the relationship from the late 1970s through to sometime in the 2010s. So I think it's just an interesting way of thinking about that mindset, and this, I think, maps technology competition, right, in particular, right, where the benefits for US companies were immense. The development of these national champions in the US was clear, but eventually that logic reversed. And so I think this really came to a head in 2022 with the export controls on semiconductors. And so you had Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, describe technologies as force multipliers that were so foundational to the future of US national security that not only did the US want to lead, but it needed to have the largest lead possible, right? And so I think built into that was not just we have to push ahead, but we have to hold China down. And the next month, you saw export controls that were quite unprecedented in their function and in their scope. They looked to control the activities of US persons. They controlled foreign production when it used US technology, all to sort of limit access to China to these technologies. And they were strengthened across 2023, I think most famously by the limitation of lithography machines, which are the things that make chips, made primarily by the Netherlands, but also by Japan and South Korea. You saw those countries, well, not South Korea, but Japan and the Netherlands join in with the US on limiting the export of lithography machines. All right, and so I think that matches the logic that I described to you theoretically, I think, quite well. And this is a very big deal. It's a big deal because, not because export controls are new. Export controls are a feature of the Cold War, right? Forever, it made sense that you did not want to export a weapon to a country that you might fight eventually on the battlefield. But it was easier in the Cold War to say, well, we're not going to export that missile to the Soviets because we don't want them to fire it right back at us. And so the export control regime called COCOM that was put into place was sort of very explicitly about arms control, really. And it was quite easy to work out what you shouldn't export. But the focus on semiconductors highlights how the US, at least, finds it very difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish between the military uses of technology from legitimate civilian uses, right? Chips can be used in either, right? They can go into your phone or they can go into a weapon. And that makes it extremely difficult to target military applications. Instead, you have to go up the supply chain and impose restrictions in ways that not just target military uses, which can be justified more easily, but actually a lot of civilian uses as well. And that, of course, you can imagine how that's received in Beijing. They're like, well, you're trying to contain us, right? Like, we're just trying to build national companies to compete in markets, and you are trying to suffocate those markets. And that's a really difficult dilemma, right? There's no correct answer, and I've got a very bad, hard to see graphic of the semiconductor supply chain on the left there. But you can see the dilemma, right? Like, if you're worried this tech's going to be used against you in a conflict, you rightfully want to stop it being exported. But how can you just focus on that one aspect without capturing all these legitimate civilian uses? So it's a very big deal, it's very consequential, and it's very fraught. Very fraught. Now, that's, I think, my effort to sort of explain a US perspective, because I think they're making the most interesting moves at the moment on technology. China continues to sort of push ahead with its own drive for self-sufficiency. What the Chinese government is calling high-quality productive forces, and their effort to sort of lead in technology from where the government is playing a central role in leading that process. To finish up, I want to kind of talk about, give you one slide at least on how we might think about this. And to do that, I've got this diagram of the national interest, which has three pillars to it, or three lenses, security, prosperity, and values. Because smaller countries have interests that span all three. On the prosperity sphere, of course, we are consumers of technology, right? Technology is good for economic growth, and so we want technology to drive development at low cost, at high quality, with speed, and of course with ease of adoption and interoperability. And if we are a country that has industries that want to build upon technologies, we want them to be able to participate, right, in these technology supply chains. So that's the economic interest. Then you have the security dimension, right? it's a bit different, but there are echoes. We are also worried about technologies creating vulnerabilities, right? Whether it's particular intelligence risks or the weaponization or the sabotage of technology products. We don't want our autonomy and independence compromised by the technology choices that we make. But we also are aware that the technology choices that we're making are also nested within this extremely tense geopolitical environment where the choices we make are seen through this zero-sum lens by the major powers. We don't want to have to choose necessarily, and this varies, of course, across countries, in terms of how sensitive they are to this choice. But on some level, right, we have to understand that the choices we make and the reasons we have for making them are not necessarily viewed in that light by Washington and Beijing. They will view our choices through the lens of their competition rather than through us making choices in our interest. And that poses a security risk to us. And then finally, we have our own values, right? Like we want to use technologies and the standards embedded within them in ways that support national values and cultures, preserve them, and support institutions rather than undermine them, right? So, these of course, these interests don't work together, right? They might conflict with each other, as many policy choices do. But I think it's important that we try to kind of map out the different types of interests we have in order then to kind of make a calculation on any given case what exactly is the right choice. Like you'll notice I'm not sort of digging into an individual issue, just trying to kind of give you a framework for thinking about these choices, and we can debate a given technology if you want to in the Q&A. So, to finish off, everyone wants and needs technology, right? It's a foundational element to economic development and prosperity and modernity. And to repeat what I said before, the challenge that smaller countries face is that their technology policy choices or their technology choices made for perhaps prosaic economic reasons or values-based reasons or even security reasons, they are going to be viewed by the major powers as affecting their geopolitical interests. And there's not much we can do about that, but we can, there are some things and we can talk about them in the Q&A, but this is a reality. And so one dimension of our technology thinking has to be to recognise and have visibility of those impacts, right? And that involves understanding how the major powers are thinking about their interests in technology, how that feeds into the rivalry, and then from our point of view, how can we kind of mitigate some of the geopolitical impacts? How can we avoid being seen as being like necessarily on one side or the other if we want to? Or even if we are choosing sides, to have a clear visibility of like what we're doing and why we're doing it, and understanding how it's going to be received by the major players. And so this is not, there's no answers here. It's really about recognising that the geopolitical rivalry we're in right now is going to last for a very long time, possibly, decades, if not generations. And we can't afford kind of to ignore it, right? We don't face a binary choice. We face hundreds of choices, right? Some of which will be binary, some of which will be whatever the opposite of binary is. And we're going to have to sort of understand why, right, we face these choices before we actually can make them. And that is about understanding the geopolitical context in which these choices are presented to us. So I know that's very vague, but I'm going to leave that there and throw it out there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Anyone for questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that framework. The one area that I think many of us are most concerned about is actually the idea of cyber warfare and its impact at being able now to not disintegrate but to undermine our social fabric. When I say our, anywhere. And it is high technology, but it's kind of hacking type stuff. But essentially, it's obvious that there are cyber warfare factories in China and obviously in Russia, and they're damn effective. And I just wonder how you fit cyber warfare into your model.
Yeah, there are features of the modern world, and I would add, like social media, the phenomenon of social media and disinformation ecosystems to cyber warfare, as there's sort of these external structural conditions that make everything harder. The same way that sort of telecommunications technology or even just travelling technology, boats to trains to planes, kind of change the relationship between states and the policy challenges that are faced by national governments. So do the risk of cyber war or hacking and cyber crime, as well as, say, social media, create extra complications. So how do they fit into the model? Well, you can try to make policy at a national level and say, we are going to have these standards, these best practices, these warning systems, these control mechanisms to help us guard against cyber war. Sure. But then the next step of that is to understand, okay, how are these choices going to be viewed by the major powers? So you might have a country that says, we're extremely worried about the integrity of our technology. We think it's particularly vulnerable to cyber hacking and so forth. And so we're going to make one set of choices in our national security that might be a bit more expensive, but we believe that. You might have another country who says, well, everyone spies and everyone hacks. We just want the technology in the ground the fastest, and that will power our development. And we're okay with those risks that might be presented. And so, I'm channeling a particular leader from one country who said that, and I'm channeling other countries that have said the former. Both have been said. Both of those are going to get received, opposite reactions from the major players. And so, again, how do you think about it? Like, ultimately, you're going to be weighing up in the national interest how much of a concern is cyber war or cyber vulnerabilities to you, and what trade-offs do you face, and what's the right balance? More restrictive measures might lock you into one ecosystem and deprive you opportunities elsewhere, but maybe it's more secure as a result. More open slather, might give you more opportunities, but there might be more risks borne by, individuals or companies and so forth. And you might be able to mitigate those. So there's, again, like the same thing with social media. I mean, social media has really changed not just sort of the vulnerability of systems, but it's changed our politics. And you can complain about the power of companies or individuals like Elon Musk in terms of how they are able to leverage that ecosystem in ways that have political consequences. But then you've got to ask, okay, what's the alternative? Like, are we going to clamp down on it? Are we going to try to limit technologies that has consequences for our values as well as our prosperity and potentially our security altogether? So I'm not giving you a very satisfying answer, but I think my big point is that a choice that you make on something like cyber war is no longer an isolated choice. It is nested within a larger geopolitical environment as well as an economic one and a values-based one, and all of them have to be on your plate, unfortunately, when you're making the call.
Yeah, so just a quick one. And obviously Macron had Pavel of Telegram arrested yesterday. So I'm just saying Pavel, who is the founder of Telegram messaging system, was arrested yesterday in Paris because he's a French citizen. So there's an interesting, that's a big deal in terms of a national government deciding to intervene, and just as you've said, in one major messaging system with consequences that could be good and could be bad.
Yeah, I don't know much about that case, but my understanding is the charge against him is the failure of moderation, essentially like not enough guardrails, right, in the Telegram system. And you can see why that would be a problem. But you can also see why, you can observe that Europe has very few technology champions, right? And that regulation has many would argue has stifled the technology ecosystem, which is why all the, America has the big tech companies rather than Europe. And so this is probably not going to help with that. But like, if you value privacy, if you value content moderation and other equities, that might be okay. Like, you might be okay with that trade-off. So there's no right answer. There's just trade-offs everywhere you look.
Darren, thanks. Values seem to me to be the weakest of the three elements of the national interest trinity you had at the end. I wonder if you could just describe your sense about how values may have helped us with those earlier order shifts that you described, and whether, in fact, you agree with my proposition that we're still evolving a values structure to more robustly provide us the framework completion that we need to deal with those security and prosperity challenges.
Yeah, how do I answer that? Values don't. It's easy, I think, to make day-to-day decisions based mostly on sort of that security versus prosperity trade-off, and I think that's probably okay. And that one should think about values as providing boundaries on the larger set of choices. Like, once you cross that, then it becomes an area where you are going to do something. But within a broader, within the safe space, you are trading off security and prosperity. In the 1940s, these values wasn't really contested because the US had won the war. The Soviets weren't involved in the post-war order that the US was building with the UK and other partners through the UN and the GATT and the Bretton Woods in particular. I mean, I'm more on the economic side. I'm focused, and so values, weren't central, but they did play some role in like, you could think of the post-war economic project as trying to avoid the 1930s, right? The beggar thy neighbour, protectionism, which clearly contributed to the animus that gave us World War II, although it probably wasn't the major cause. That was Nazism, but it was not. It did not help. And so there was a belief that we needed to reform the system to allow free trade to flourish. But free trade is not unambiguously good. It creates winners and losers. It creates problems. There are market failures. There are times when markets fail. And so there were protections built into the Bretton Woods agreements and exceptions in the GATT that allowed countries to pursue other national interests. Now, you could think of them as security, right? There was a security exception in GATT, but there was provisions in the Bretton Woods agreements about balance of payments that you could essentially engage in currency manipulation to, in order to sort of solve particular balance of payments crises that had potentially catastrophic sort of consequences for sort of social cohesion and social welfare. And so, broadly, there was an understanding that governments should be able to build welfare states, or the New Deal logic of FDR found its way into those agreements in the understanding that you didn't have to sort of be a slave to the exchange rates and to sort of neoliberalism. You could build safety nets, right? And so you could frame that as values, or you could frame that as a recognition that you need some social license to have a political and economic system, and so you're going to create you're going to create some safety valves or release valves to acknowledge those things. And so the major example of that, though, in the modern world, which hasn't been in my presentation at all, is climate change, right? That a lot of climate change policy might not be good for national security if you are enabling choke points to accumulate in potentially unfriendly countries. It might not be good for your prosperity if it undermines free trade. But whether I don't know what you want to call it. Is it a value? Is it a security interest? It's all of them, right? But it kind of sits separately. But we don't have good rules yet that allow us to kind of say this is a legitimate interest, however you frame it, it clashes with other interests, but it shouldn't be unacceptable. Like, it shouldn't be prohibited because it is really important. But we don't have any rules yet for kind of bounding that. And that's part of the challenge we face, is that the system we have that comes from the 1940s, it was designed to solve different problems. Now, some of those problems are perennial, like we don't want to go back to the 1930s, and so we face a risk of that today. Protectionism could just get stronger and stronger, but we have new problems today. And so the system just isn't really well adapted to that, and that's a work in progress.
Hello, I'm Stephanie Honey. I'm a trade policy consultant and a former New Zealand WTO negotiator, so I very much appreciated your last answer. And in fact, your whole presentation was just fantastic. Thank you. I really, loved a lot of what you said. But classic conference stuff. I've got two quick comments and a question. The first one is, I would say the slide that you put up with China versus the US, what are their strategies, and for China, taking and so on. I think it is also actually trying to shape things. I mean, it's a very strong advocate for some of that sort of GATT approach to things, multilateralism. It's also very active in technology standard setting, and has really captured a lot of the ground there. The second thing I would say is your final slide about what is the strategy for small states. I mean, I think that's something where New Zealand and Australia and a number of the other sort of small and middle-sized states in the Asia-Pacific in particular are actually really demonstrating that they can have some agency in this. I mean, we're all negotiating digital trade agreements that, are really trying to be norm setters as well. But that does bring me to my third thing, the question. The payoff slide that you looked at, I mean, there are some obvious, sort of relative payoff losses for the US and China. But the IMF has done some really interesting work looking at, okay, but what's the global effect of technological decoupling? And, it's a pretty bad story. GDP contraction of 7%, I think, and, some much more significant numbers for some economies. So at what point do you think these current sort of US-China strategies, is the economics going to bite? Because at some point, and I see this in the trade space, digital is everywhere through trade now. There's no part of trade that is not affected, enabled, done through digital technologies. At what stage will the economic losses of these sorts of strategies actually bring them back to the neoliberal, non-discriminatory, multilateral, we all benefit from working together kind of mindset? Thanks.
The glib way of starting to answer that question is I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said, in the long run, we're all dead. And so his point being that a lot can happen before, the economic laws of gravity finally kick in. I mean, you could make this argument about the Chinese system more generally, like they've spent billions of dollars subsidising things. Sometimes it's worked, EVs and solar cells. Semis, it doesn't seem to be working nearly as well, and a lot of money has been spent. And so I know the point is that we probably don't want to hold our breath for those laws of gravity to kick in, and we also want to be careful what we wish for, because that might lead to sort of some kind of conflict, right, that resets everything. I mean, these sort of pivot points in history, if you're a historical institutionalist, this only gets solved with war, which is not a good way of a very optimistic scenario. So I think the practical or sort of the positive agenda that comes out of that is not to sort of say, well, we're going to become significantly poorer. It is to sort of to build on an answer I said earlier about rules. It is to say you have serious concerns, whether it's in national security, or in climate, or in social welfare. Economic nationalism is a big thing now. These are not wholly without merit, but they do require us to depart from the principles of free trade, and free trade is good. And so we can all agree that We don't want to bring down the entire system. But we just have no sense now of what that means, right? Look, how do we put boundaries on a national security exception? Article 21 of the GATT doesn't help us. It's too vague. So we can't scold people like Jake Sullivan for saying we don't want our tech used against us on the battlefield. We have to say, okay, sure, like I can accept that, but like, what does that mean? Like, we need rules to like some kind of boundaries. And that's the agenda that comes out of it, is like we need someone to draft rules, right? Like, what is it that can be litigated or could in theory be litigated? We talked about this afternoon. Someone mentioned the CPTPP as a kind of venue where that could happen. But like nothing's stopping a bright, enterprising New Zealand trade lawyer from like writing a national security exception that actually is fit for purpose, or a climate change decarbonisation trade exception. The only way to stop, the story I like to tell was when Trump put tariffs on New Zealand steel, right? The mechanism he used to do that was one that was rooted in national security. So on some level, he was saying that you guys posed a national security threat to the US, which is obviously absurd. But that's where it goes, right? It's a slippery slope where everything becomes national security, and that is kind of how they're thinking in Washington and Beijing for different reasons. But you've got to sort of start somewhere and say, okay, I'm not going to argue that it's going to make everyone poorer because that's not going to resonate with you, but I'm going to say that surely you can agree that 1930s were bad and that trade is useful, and so okay, let's work together on building some rules. And so that's, I think, the one kind of vaguely positive forward-leaning agenda that comes out of your question, rather than when are they going to get like beaten down by the laws of gravity, which I also agree exist, but they exist to the extent that they impoverish. Not that leads to political consequences, right? The political consequence might be, and this is an interesting kind of a divergence here, so forgive me, but I think it's an interesting one. There's a guy who wrote a book. His name's Karl Polanyi, and the book was published in 1945. It's called The Great Transformation, and it's a book about what happens when you try to make markets function in the purest sense of the word. And he uses this language of disembedding them from just the societies in which they operate. And his argument is that the Industrial Revolution was this great attempt to disembed markets and essentially say there are only laws of economic gravity. And Adam Smith was completely correct, more correct even than he envisaged. But the problem with that is that when you do that, people don't like it. And Polanyi called this the double movement, but it's this social backlash against the dehumanisation of markets, right? We need to understand that markets only exist to serve people, and we can't adhere to like ultra laissez-faire neoliberal orthodoxies, because people eventually will pick up their pitchforks and say and their torches, and they'll come for you. And he wrote that. He was Austrian, I think. But he wrote that during the World War, and what was so interesting was that in the 1930s, like you could read the 1920s or the post-World War I era as this kind of like the Roaring '20s, right, as this hyper process of disembedding markets, and that led to these two responses, right? But the response could be progressive, which is what it was in the US with the New Deal, or it could be reactionary, which is what it was in Germany with Nazism. And so my point is that like when the economic hens come home to roost, you have to be careful about what political reaction comes out of that. It might not necessarily be the one that is progressive and brings us back to 1945. It could be something much darker and brings us to 1933 instead. And in many ways, what you're seeing with the populist movements over the past 10 years, you are seeing some reactionary elements to that. Like Trump kind of represents this, and he's not alone. There is a broader malaise, social malaise that's being expressed through these kinds of political forces. And you can read a lot of what the Biden administration is doing is trying to, as much as what they're doing might depart from principles of free trade, it's trying to recognise that you can't do anything unless you can kind of claim the political ground from Trumpism. And so that's the foreign policy for the middle class, one of their mantras, right? Not particularly neoliberal, in many ways pretty bad economics, but a political project that is trying to maintain as much of the old system as we can, but recognising that a lot of it has lost its social licence, and so they are going to have to go with those currents to a large extent because the alternative is much worse.
Join me in thanking. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you, Darren, for certainly, again, another very insightful conversation. Please join us outside for some drinks and nibbles. I'd also like to take an opportunity to thank the Australian High Commission for working with us and bringing Darren out. So thank you once again, and join us outside to continue the conversation. Thank you.